All right, Jason Reza Jorjani, PhD. Welcome to the 87th episode of NEOHUMAN podcast, sir.
It's a pleasure to be with you, Agha.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to this conversation. And kudos and shout out to Julia Prisco, who recommended your book, which I really want to talk about the book called Prometheism, which is the beginning of a movement, I believe, called the Prometheus movement, right?
Yeah, it's a synthesis of the words Prometheus and theism. Prometheism.
Yeah. Excellent. So I mainly want to talk about that, but I also want to talk about politics and Iran, and let's see where the conversation leads us.
Absolutely, shoot.
Yeah, let's start with your background, though, just so we have some kind of a context that where your thoughts are coming from. You know, the work you've done, the lives you've lived, and what are you mainly focused on now these days?
Well, I did my my master's at NYU, and my master's, first of all, I'm born and raised in New York City. So I'm a lifelong native New Yorker, and I'm of Persian paternal descent. And my mother is an American of many generations who ultimately hails from Northern European background. A lot of Celtic and a lot of Nordic blood in her background. But her family's been in America for many generations. In fact, they've been New Yorkers as well for a couple of generations. So that's my family background. And, you know, I went to school here in New York. I did an MA thesis on universal human rights and the problem of Islamic democracy at NYU. And there I was analyzing the philosophical foundations of the UDHR, the UN Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and showing how it's internally contradictory because its provision for an unqualified freedom of religion allows so-called Islamic democracies to undermine the human rights of minorities who are dissenting within that society. And so I was trying to expose this loophole in the UDHR, going back even into the drafting debates in Paris and in San Francisco that produced the Universal Declaration, and showing how there were representatives from various countries, oddly enough, including the Soviet Union, who understood that this was a serious problem that would undermine the coherence of the Declaration. And they wanted a very carefully worded, qualified freedom of religion that would protect universal human rights from some how could I put it, disingenuous attempt to use freedom of religion to then institute something like Sharia law and divest citizens of their other basic rights, like, you know, the equality of women or freedom of conscience, freedom of expression, freedom of the press, so on and so forth. So that was my MA thesis work. And then I did a PhD at the State University of New York on philosophy of science and technology. And there I was looking at the empirical evidence from basically a century of research in parapsychology to argue in favor of something like Heidegger's thesis about the ontological priority of technology over science, that when you look at an existential level, when you look at technology and science, you see that people usually have the relationship between them backwards, that technology is not applied theoretical science. Technological innovation is not an application of what is understood through some kind of putatively pure theoretical scientific research. Actually, theoretical science is grounded on technology. And in fact, the human existence itself emerges from out of our pre-human hominid relationship with, you know, technology. So technology is the more existentially primary phenomenon, and I use the evidence from parapsychology to argue that and to argue against overly reductive materialistic paradigms in science. And then the upshot of my doctoral dissertation, which developed into my book, Prometheus and Atlas, which, you know, from out of which I developed the core thesis of my book, Prometheus and Atlas, was that Heidegger was right to suggest that technology has, I suppose, what you could call a spiritual essence, that there is a spirit of technology, a motivating spirit or genius, a spectral essence of technology. And I argued that that spectral essence of technology is Promethean in nature. So on the other side of the exhaustion and implosion of these reductive materialist models in science is a potential rediscovery of the Promethean spirit that was the wellspring of technoscientific innovation from the start, particularly in Western civilization, but in the Indo-European world at large, really.
Very interesting. The relationship between science and technology, that the way that you described it, reminded me of how we're using mathematics to figure out how the universe works, but it doesn't mean that universe works according to mathematics. It's just that we have a tool that we can discover this unknown, that we might end up having many other tools other than mathematics, but this is something that reveals something that has been there for perhaps much longer than we can even comprehend.
Indeed. And, in my beginning in my doctoral work, and then very substantively in Prometheus and Atlas, I look at the deep structure of mathematical thought and connect it to the archetype of Prometheus, because, Prometheus's very name means forethought. And the Greek term from which we get mathematics, mathesis, is in the name of Prometheus. That's the methe in Prometheus. And so mathematics is really about casting a net over the world, a net of abstraction that allows you to understand something about things that you haven't even researched yet. So it is a kind of projective anticipation. Mathematics is ultimately not about number crunching. At its deepest level, what it is a mentality that allows you to capture phenomena within a grid and then project forward from what's happening to what will happen in the future. It's an anticipatory resoluteness that grasps the world in a very abstract fashion. And that's really an expression of the human will to gain, mastery and dominance over nature with a view to, securing the conditions for human flourishing. And I don't think it's an accident that mentality came from out of the Caucasian world. I say the Caucasian world not to limit it to Europe, but also to include Iran, because really the first instance of this kind of mathematical mentality in its essence is with Zoroastrianism. It's really in Zarathustra that you see this kind of future-oriented mentality in the first place. And it's also not coincidental that the other great bastion of technological science in the world besides Europe was Iran in the medieval period, in what was the European medieval period. And so in the Caucasian world at large, whether it's Europe or whether it's Iran, I don't think it's an accident that was the cradle from out of which this mathematical mentality developed, because it's a part of the world where you have very adverse climate conditions. You have extreme seasonal weather, and people had to learn how to prepare for long, cold winters. And so this goes again back to the forethought that's characteristic of Prometheus.
Before we move any further, you were the co-founder, I was reading, of Alt-Right Corporation. Is that right?
That's correct.
Okay, so this term alt-right, we never understood what exactly it means, because the moment anybody brought it up, everybody said, oh, shut up, you're Nazi, racist. Well, you're very familiar, I'm sure, with all of these labels that have been given to me as well. That I'm a Middle Eastern, a former refugee, current immigrant, and somehow I'm a bigot and a racist and an Islamophobe and all those things, just to dare questioning these things. So let's define this term alt-right and then talk a little about alt-right corporation and how any of that interject into your perspective and philosophical worldview.
Yeah, long story short, I'll give you the nutshell version of it. So alt-right is an abbreviation of alternative right, of course. And this term was actually coined by a Jewish intellectual, Paul Gottfried. And Richard Spencer took it over from him, okay? So Richard Spencer had been using this term alt-right beginning, I think, in the 2014, 2015, something like that. But it hadn't really caught on very much. And there was this phenomenon in Europe, which was much more significant, called the New Right, Nouvelle Droite. And my book, Prometheus and Atlas, had been published by the leading New Right, Nouvelle Droite publisher, Arctos Media, in 2016. So,
which you're the founder of?
Of what?
Arctos Media?
No.
Oh, okay.
I became editor-in-chief of Arctos for about a year, and I'll get into how that happened. So alternative right is an alternative to what? It's an alternative to the mainstream establishment, so-called, right wing.
Yeah.
And the mainstream establishment, and one of the reasons that it considers itself an alternative to this is because it, from the alt-right perspective, these modes of political thought are not really on the right. So what are we talking about? Conservatism. Okay, so evangelicals who are inclined toward a certain kind of conservatism in the United States, that's one position that's been characterized as right within the establishment. A large portion of Congress in the United States basically subscribes to that political doctrine of a kind of very mainstream conservatism, and one that's inclined toward accepting the moral ideology of evangelical Christianity as the basis for legislation. Then you have libertarians who may not be, so favorably inclined toward Christianity, but who are often characterized as on the right because of, their very staunch opposition to socialism, to social welfare policies. They're wanting to extremely limit the functions of government, and they're very strong emphasis on, let's say, the right to bear arms, and to protect your private property and your sort of domestic sphere from government interference by any and all means necessary. So you have libertarians, you have conservatives who form kind of a mainstream right, and then you also have the neoconservatives, the neocons, who were a third sort of branch of the mainstream right that the alt-right was presenting itself as an alternative to. And the alt-right's problem with the neocons in particular is that the neocons tend to be advocates of, perpetual worldwide military intervention. So they have a program of, serial regime change in various countries carried out by the United States. And these regime change efforts, are extremely costly and detrimental to seeing to all kinds of domestic needs, whether it's a deterioration of infrastructure domestically or other programs that would, benefit American citizens. When we waste $3 trillion in Iraq, basically to remove, look, you and I are from a Persian background, so, we hate Saddam Hussein. Saddam Hussein was a horrible person, okay, who was responsible for, the massacre of about 500,000 innocent Iranian civilians. Be that as it may, stepping back and looking at it relatively objectively, Saddam Hussein was a secular authoritarian leader. And this $3 trillion was burned to replace him with a Shiite theocracy on the one hand and a Sunni fundamentalist Islamic State on the other hand. Okay, so the alt-right also considered itself an alternative to this kind of pathological neocon impulse to engage in all these regime change endeavors that are of little benefit to the American people. In fact, quite likely detrimental to the United States over the long term. Of course, these interventions in Iraq and Syria also catalyzed the mass migration into Europe, which has been catastrophic for Europe. Mass migration of people from the Middle East and North Africa into Europe, including the Libyan attempt at regime change. So the alt-right was an extremely amorphous rubric to categorize any one of a number of right-wing positions that are alternatives to these mainstream types of the political right, whether it's an alternative to libertarianism or to conservatism or to neoconservatism, which is actually not really conservative. It's like a classical liberal position, one that some people trace back to Leo Strauss. In any case, the alt-right did not have any cohesive or coherent identity other than being defined against these mainstream forms of quote-unquote right-wing politics in the United States. And so it was very much up for grabs when I got involved, in 2016. As Trump was running for office, I was encouraged because my book, Prometheus and Atlas, did so well in the Arctos community in the European Nouvelle Droite, and because I also had a following in the United States that came largely from my work in parapsychology, and Prometheus and Atlas being sort of very well received by the parapsychology research community, I was encouraged to play a mediating role in integrating three major institutions in what became the alternative right. So Arctos Press, the leading press of the Nouvelle Droite in Europe, Red Ice Radio and Television, which was a program that dealt with, parapsychology subjects, UFOs, all kinds of sort of fringe subject matters, but which took a hard right political turn around 2015. And I had a relationship with, Hendrik Palmgren, the head of Red Ice Radio and Television, based on, our common interest in the types of subjects covered in Prometheus and Atlas. So I was being published by Arctos. I was involved with Red Ice, and then, I was encouraged, to reach out to Richard Spencer, whose conference, NPI conference in the fall of 2016, I attended as a representative of Arctos.
This was in D.C.
In D.C., yes. This became the infamous Hailgate conference, Hail Trump, Hail Victory, and so forth, with the Roman salute, which I'm not going to make on camera right now, because we don't need a secondary defamation. But I was encouraged to integrate these three organizations into something called the Alt-Right Corporation. And my main motivation in doing that, at that moment, was to make sure that this alt-right did not wind up sinking into the swamp of white nationalism and a kind of, ghetto of racially narrow-minded identity politics. I had a vision, especially considering we were integrating a European organization with an American organization, and considering the fact that at the same time, like 4 months before I got involved with Richard Spencer, and I also accepted the position as editor-in-chief of Arctos, about 4 months before that, in the late spring of 2016, I had gotten involved with an organization called the Persian Renaissance Foundation, informally known as the Iranian Renaissance. And so my vision was and I laid this out in some detail in my book, World State of Emergency, my second book in 2017. My vision was to create a pan-Indo-European alliance, which would have a European wing, an American wing, and then connect to future Neo-Zoroastrian or Neo-Mithraic Iran and India, and then ultimately end in, go all the way through Russia as well, through Eurasia, and end in the Buddhist East, with Japan being the principal representative of the Buddhist East. So America, Europe, Russia, Iran, India, and Japan as sort of nodes in a global Indo-European network that would promote an alternative, loosely right-wing political philosophy that would guide humanity through the impending technological singularity in the most constructive way possible. That was my vision. But unfortunately, the people who had encouraged me to play this mediating, unifying role in the alt-right never came through with their significant capital investment that they promised. And so, long story short, I lost control of the corporation. And my associates really went, in their own direction, particularly Richard Spencer, who initially was very much on board with this Indo-European vision, but then, as the funding didn't come through and as he continued to be caricatured in the mainstream media as this white nationalist leader, he unfortunately decided to reaffirm that, cardboard cutout that had been made of him. Because I think in some way it was like a vicious cycle where the more attention he got from playing that role, the more, he felt like he should reaffirm it.
That's the objective, though.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, well, it wasn't my objective.
No. The objective of people who are putting labels on people like Spencer and you.
Exactly. So he fell right into the trap. Yeah. He fell right into the trap. And unfortunately, I wasn't given the material resources to be able to, resist that any more than I did. And at a certain point, specifically when Charlottesville happened, I couldn't endorse the direction that the organization was going in, and so I resigned. I resigned also from my position as editor-in-chief of Arctos. And then and I predicted this, I did an interview with NBC right after I resigned from the Alt-Right Corporation, and I predicted that the organization would be embroiled in infighting and it would disintegrate and implode within a very short time after I left. And that's in fact what happened. I think it lasted about 6 to 8 months after my resignation and then imploded.
Yeah. Such is a story of human civilization that it's really, really difficult to bring people together. especially when there is establishment, mainstream, status quo kind of a force that is playing the arbiter. That I've never heard anybody describe alt-right the way that you did. And I've never heard until maybe 2 weeks ago that Steve Bannon started talking about the purpose of the populist movement today to prevent people who are in charge today to be in charge when the singularity happens. But other than that, this is the first time I'm hearing any kind of a directive and any kind of a coherent, technologically based argument and direction coming from the right. And I think this is a huge gap that exists within the right, that they're not talking about what are we going to do in this coming decade to create some kind of a viable alternative, because the far left is taking over Google AI department. There's a civil war going on right there right now, which I'm mind blown. Nobody's talking about it.
Yeah.
They're targeting all the right places, while the other side is talking about you can't even get the election right. That is so obviously flawed.
Well, you mentioned Steve Bannon. This is a book that I would recommend to people who are interested in Steve Bannon. I'm not entirely happy with the portrayal of me in this book. I think this guy did a pretty good job overall. But about 30 pages of this book are focused on my efforts to unify the alt-right. And the reason I wind up making an appearance in this book is because those who promised the capital investment in the alt-right corporation had actually, this is what they claimed. They had intended to make me a liaison between the alt-right and the White House. And Steve Bannon was supposed to be the interface person. I was supposed to be the guy who would go into the White House and talk to Steve Bannon, in a kind of respectable fashion on behalf of, some more colorful characters in the alt-right. And so it doesn't surprise me at all that Bannon would make these remarks about preparing a political ideology that would be adequate to handling the challenges of the technological singularity. Because, in fact, that was exactly the discussion taking place when it was proposed that I act as this liaison. So, yes, big tech is in bed with the Chinese. And, whether it's Google, who's effectively, a front for the CIA, or whether it's, Facebook or Twitter or whatever, these companies are, or Amazon, these companies are in bed with the Chinese. And the worst thing that could possibly happen is for the Chinese to take the lead in developing genetic engineering, as they are right now. Mm-hmm. They're literally, I think last week a story came out that they're genetically engineering super soldiers. Yeah. So, and that was widely reported in the mainstream media. So the worst thing that could happen is the Chinese take the lead in genetic engineering. They take the lead in nanotech and AI development. And the way in which they roll out these technologies, which have the potential to fundamentally alter the parameters of human existence, are ways in which are ways that are going to lead to the degradation of human individuality, to the degeneration of the potential for genius and innovative creative thought. I can well imagine the Chinese using gene editing to recalibrate the human being into something more, quote unquote, cooperative, into a more cooperative citizen, which also, by the same token, is less capable of independent, innovative thought. And that would be an utter catastrophe.
And they're doing it right now.
They're doing it right now.
This is not science fiction.
Yeah. And look, if we're left with a bunch of evangelical conservatives who are already, interested in bombing abortion clinics as our only resistance, we're screwed, because there's no way that a Luddite regressive right wing is going to be able to compete with the Chinese. We need an archaeo-futuristic right-wing political ideology that is capable of embracing the full scope of potential of these emerging technologies.
Yep, that's exactly what it is. And I'm not optimistic about, I love United States, but I don't know what it is. Is it the openness of the system, or is it just a cultural and the evaluation of the culture that exists in the system, that a lot of it is religious? Because Chinese have this opportunity to do genetic engineering without having this dead end of do not interfere in God's business. You know, while nobody else is talking about, well, it could be God's business that allow us to genetically experiment with humanity, you know, like God's business don't end at any certain kind of a point. So,
well, certainly not a Promethean God.
So please describe this Promethean God, because when I I haven't read the entire book, but I read Julia Prisco's review and I read some excerpts of it. It seems like it's a new, for lack of a better term, it's a new religion and a philosophy merged into one for this coming age that has already begun.
Yeah. So when you look at the myth of Prometheus, you know, there are certain principal characteristics or basic elements of this archetype that could be the basis for developing a new sociopolitical vision, right? And so Prometheus, he's not just an enlightener God, the God who brings, you know, the fire of the forge and the light of science to humanity. He's also the creator of humanity. You know, in Greek mythology, it's not Zeus who creates humanity. It's actually Prometheus. So, you know, this whole vision we get in the Ridley Scott films of the engineers having created humanity in their own image, that's very much in line with the Prometheus myth. So and then Prometheus is, of course, also the first martyr God. You know, it's asked backwards to say that Prometheus is a Christ-like figure, because actually the image of Christ as a God who martyrs himself for humanity, for his children, is something that's it's basically being aped from the Prometheus myth. Christ is aping Prometheus insofar as he's a God who sacrifices himself for his children. So when I look at the whole structure of the Prometheus myth, and then, you know, it's important not to neglect the fact that the very first installment of this, you know, long story arc of Prometheus, before even the creation of humanity, is that Prometheus rebels against his fellow Titans. So this guy, he's an inveterate rebel. He rebels against his fellow Titans, against Kronos or Saturn, and helps Zeus come to power and helps to install the Olympians, only to realize that Zeus is almost as bad as Kronos. And then he schemes on behalf of humanity against Olympus and aims to also overthrow Zeus. So this is the God who's a rebel against all gods. And so when I look at this whole story arc, from Prometheus rebelling against the Titans, helping Zeus come to power, but then turning against Zeus, being the creator of humanity, and then someone who gifts humanity with the fire of technological innovation and the light of scientific knowledge after Zeus subjugates humanity to slavery and enforced ignorance, and then ultimately Prometheus being willing to be chained to the Caucasus Mountains and have his liver pecked out every day as a martyr god for humanity. Certain basic characteristics of Prometheus jump out at me that could be formulated into principles that would serve as the basis for a new sociopolitical vision. And I would lay those out in the following way. I'd say there are about 7 of them. The first one would be Prometheus as forethought. You know, the reason because his very name means forethought. The reason his liver is being pecked out by Zeus's eagle is because the liver was used for fortune telling in Greece. It was like, you know, like tea leaf readers reading tea leaves, or people who look into crystal balls. A form of augury and fortune telling, of prophesying in archaic Greece, was looking into the blackness of the liver by candlelight. And so Prometheus is the god of forethought and the one who's always thinking ahead. Prometheus is a creator. He's the creator of humanity. Prometheus is also an enlightener. He fits into the category of all the enlightener gods like Quetzalcoatl or Enki or Ahura Mazda. He is an enlightener god who brings science and technology to a otherwise benighted humanity. And Prometheus is also the god of exploration. And this comes across particularly clearly in Shelley's rendition of Prometheus, Mary Shelley's rendition of Prometheus, namely Frankenstein or the modern Prometheus. There's a whole story within a story presented in that novel that's about, you know, Walton's seafaring quest of exploration, breaking the Arctic ice and, you know, trying to conquer the North Pole. That's another aspect of the Frankenstein story that's often missed in popular culture, is that the quest of Dr. Frankenstein to re-engineer humanity is sort of complemented by this story of Arctic exploration. And so the explorer is analogized with the intrepid scientific genius working in his laboratory. And so I would say the exploration that's quintessentially characteristic of the Faustian West is another aspect of the Prometheus mythos. I mean, it's astonishing if you look at the history of exploration, of explorers, mountain climbers, ocean explorers, all people who penetrated the Amazon jungle. Almost all of them are from an Indo-European background. So this is also another characteristic of the Prometheus myth, of the Prometheus archetype. And then, this will to enlightenment and this boundless exploration always yields revolution, because it is a resistance to the kind of stasis and stagnation characteristic of different types of tyranny. And so Prometheus is also, of course, the rebel. He's the inveterate rebel who rebels against the Titans and then against the Olympians, and who inspires humanity's rebellion in the name of self-determination and being the masters of our own destiny. But then, that rebelliousness is perhaps most interestingly expressed in the trickster aspect of Prometheus. Prometheus is also analogous to Loki and to the coyote in Native American culture, and even to Hermes within the Olympian pantheon, insofar as he's a trickster figure, the god of machination. And there's a way in which, and I think Heidegger has this very right, if you look at the phenomenon of technological science historically, you can see technological science itself as a kind of trickery or machination, a cunning or contrivance that involves various kinds of duplicity and deception. But it's a deception that's motivated by the will to resist a superior power. It's like, David versus Goliath. And interestingly, in Ridley Scott's Prometheus prequels to his Alien films, he names the android, who is this Promethean figure, David. So it's the machinations of David against Goliath. It's using cunning and slyness and stealth in order to outwit, a power that's superior in terms of brute force. You also see this as a characteristic of the Promethean. And then finally, there's, as I mentioned earlier, the willingness to sacrifice oneself for the sake of humanity. This kind of ultra-humanism and altruism that we see in Prometheus being willing to be bound in the Caucasus and suffer a fate worse than death by having his liver torn out and regenerated every night and pecked out again the next day by Zeus's eagle. So the will to self-sacrifice and ultimately martyrdom, an idea that's very significant in Persian culture, in our shared Persian culture, shahadat, is also one key element or facet of the Prometheus archetype. So these 7, I would say, aspects of the Promethean ethos can be the basis for generating the architecture, the architectonic of a new sociopolitical worldview.
Which is centralized in nature, right? Because there is a point of alignment, that these are the ideals that we are striving for.
Yes.
So, yeah, please.
Yeah, it's a point of orientation.
So I'm not a fan of democracy, and every day I'm kind of proven right to myself that democracy is not a way forward. And it seems like beyond this period that where we're going with respect to U.S. sociopolitical gridlock right now, there is going to be something that is going to be somehow centralized, that some kind of an authority is going to determine the direction, is going to be the arbiter of meanings of all these terms that we are saying. Bravery, who is there to define bravery, right? So how do you see we're moving forward here in the United States in the coming decade from the Prometheus kind of a perspective? And where are we right now with respect to everything that you said? Because obviously these are all the quote unquote good qualities that humanity should consider. But we seem to have the kind of the problem that artificial intelligence right now has, which is the alignment problem. There is no point of, there is no goal, there is no objective for the entire humanity as a civilization to move towards.
I agree with you entirely. See, the problem is the United States of America was never intended to be a democracy.
That's right.
If you go back and you read the writings of the founding fathers, whether it's James Madison or Benjamin Franklin or Alexander Hamilton, these men loathed democracy. They thought it was the most vile and incompetent form of government in history. Okay? And what they were actually trying to do, they considered democracy a, quote, tyranny of the majority, unquote. And what they were actually trying to do was to protect the individual against the mob.
Which is the entire purpose of United States, basically.
That's the entire purpose of the United States. Okay? The rights that are enshrined in the Constitution of the United States, in the Bill of Rights, and even more fundamentally, the rights that are the opening words of the true Constitution of the United States, namely the Declaration of Independence, right? Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. These rights are rights belonging to the individual that are sacrosanct and to be protected against the will of the majority. The system was supposed to be such that even a 95%, or 99% majority of people in society cannot strip you of certain basic rights that are, quote unquote, God-given, not in the sense that they have anything to do with the biblical revelation. And if anyone thinks that, they should read Thomas Paine, read The Rights of Man or The Age of Reason, the writings of the neglected founding father of the U.S., whose only sin was that he said publicly what the rest of them thought privately, right? So the God-givenness of these rights has to do with this deist metaphysics where the human mind is a microcosm of the cosmic order. And so, for us to be able to flourish and to expand out into the cosmos and fulfill our human potential, we need to have a socio-political system that allows us to develop the reason within us that reflects the macrocosmic order, the microcosm in which the cosmic order is reflected in an embryonic form. I mean, that was the way of thinking of the founding fathers, which is very much more in line with kind of Promethean archetype than it is with anything in the revealed religions. In any case, if you read Carl Schmitt, whose preeminent student, Leo Strauss, wound up being a very influential political philosophy professor at the University of Chicago, if you read Carl Schmitt in his writings on the concept of the political, the crisis of parliamentary democracy, you see how liberals only made an alliance with Democrats because they were both against the monarchy in the 1700s. You had two very distinct schools of political thought. Democrats in the vein of Jean-Jacques Rousseau, people who wanted to bring back democracy in some sense, and you had liberals like John Stuart Mill. And these two political tendencies were actually very much opposed to one another and stood in very serious tension with one another. But they made this kind of provisional alliance in order to defeat monarchy and to transform feudal society into the kind of, society based on free enterprise that we've had since then, right? And so they created this hodgepodge liberal democracy. This is a fundamentally incoherent ideology, liberal democracy, because the whole point of liberalism, in the classical sense, not this crap that passes for liberalism today, but the whole point of advocating for political liberty is to protect the rights of the individual. Whereas a democracy inherently is based on the idea of majority rule. And the other thing about democracy that most people don't understand is that when you look at the really sophisticated theorists of democracy in the modern age, like Jean-Jacques Rousseau, you see that they knew that democracy, going all the way back to the classical Greeks, is always based on an implicit acceptance of a certain religious ideology. You cannot have coherent decision-making by a majority in a parliament or in a Congress unless they all believe in the same religion. And this is something that hasn't been understood, that democracy, I wrote about this at length in World State of Emergency, democracy is inherently theocratic. It doesn't have to be a literal theocracy like the Islamic Republic of Iran, but there needs to be a tacit acceptance of a certain religious ethos so that you have coherent long-term decision-making in the polity.
At a point of alignment.
A point of alignment. And so then what happens to the minority of dissenters in a society, those individuals who don't subscribe to the dominant religion? Well, they get persecuted. They get persecuted and ultimately, like Socrates, executed by a democratic assembly. And so liberalism and democracy were strange bedfellows to begin with. And I think what we're seeing right now in the United States is the disintegration and collapse of liberal democracy. And what we need to do is think about what kind of ideology ought to replace liberal democracy. And what I would like to see is a kind of political ideology where liberty is central, okay, to the system that's proposed to replace the current system. And the emphasis should therefore be placed on the liberal aspect of the American, founding ideology rather than on its democratic aspect. And so we need a shoring up of the rights of the individual, but that also cannot happen without acknowledging some kind of point of orientation, which will not tyrannize over society the way that the Democrats' acceptance of a theology, tacit acceptance of a theology, would tyrannize over all members of society, but would be a kind of spiritual ethos that actually protects differentiation and individuation and encourages the cultivation and flourishing of the individual. A kind of supra-religion or transcendent spirituality which accommodates religious diversity within certain bounds. You cannot allow religions to thrive in a society which are inherently intolerant religions. I mean, this idea that, freedom of religion extends to people who believe in religions so dogmatic that they believe in executing those who are, kafirs or apostates or whatever, that kind of freedom of religion is fundamentally incoherent. It's the Achilles heel that's going to be the downfall of any political system. And so it needs to be understood that, yes, there should be, people should explore spirituality in ways that are individualistic, that, promote dynamism and diversity in society, but that cannot extend to sects or cults that are in favor of forcing a certain religious ideology onto society and persecuting or even executing people who are considered apostates. So, when it comes to Islam, that poses a very significant problem for us, in terms of how we're going to restructure, say, the political system of the United States and ultimately provide a model for the whole world. It's a problem for us considering that demographically speaking, Islam will be the dominant religion on this planet within the next 30 years.
So this is really interesting. First of all, about nonsensical terms, Islamic Republic is another one of those nonsensical terms that we have been dealing with in Iran. And I talked about this many times in this podcast, that before the success of a revolution, there was an alliance between Marxists and leftists and Islamists around their common enemy, that was this capitalism and America and Shah. I still have this book right here, Answer to History, that he talks about it. He goes on and on and on. And it's really interesting how he talks about students in universities, how they don't understand anything about life and everything has been given to them. And therefore, and it's like, we're going through a twilight zone, because it's the exact same thing that is happening in the United States right now, which suggests to me this goes much deeper into human nature rather than being the outcome of any socio-political, modern socio-political system.
Yeah, people don't want freedom. People are terrified of freedom. I mean, by people, I mean what Heidegger called das Mann, the they, the majority, the mass, the mob. They don't want freedom.
Because they want security. Is that it?
They want security.
Right.
They want security. And not just like, physical security, the kind of security of, whatever, that's going to be guaranteed by a political regime. Economic security in terms of social welfare. Most fundamentally, they want psychological security. Yeah. They want, some kind of a belief system that will give them a sense of tranquility and, a kind of, inner calm and stability. People generally do not want to constantly be challenged to expand their horizons. And so, the burdensome task that is placed on our shoulders is how to develop a socio-political system that's Promethean in nature when the majority of society is very threatened by that. Where the majority of society wants, a kind of dogma that you find in, Christian evangelical interpretations of the Bible or Catholic traditionalist interpretations of the Bible, where the majority of society might even feel more comfortable with the kind of Confucian values that China wants to promote on a planetary scale than they would feel with a, Promethean socio-political vision. So it's a problem. It's a serious problem that we're going to face in terms of, how to govern a population that is really terrified of freedom, and how to salvage the American project, which was about defending, human freedom. But I think really we're in the 11th hour right now. I mean, because we are coming up against a moment that, I think you can legitimately characterize as the end of history, a kind of spike on the, exponentially
human history, though, right?
Yeah,
human history. Yeah.
The end of human history,
yeah.
And potentially the beginning of a post-human history,
yeah.
right? We're approaching a moment when we're going to pass through some kind of a great filter.
Yeah.
And I want to make sure that we do get to that moment, that there's no artificial controlled demolition of advanced industrial society and a kind of forced return to an neo-agrarian, neo-feudal way of life, and an imposition of traditional values, whether they're in the form of Catholic traditionalism or whether it's Confucianist traditionalism or some kind of global Islamic caliphate. I want to make sure that we make it to the technological singularity, and that the people who pass through that great filter are the people who are actually interested in being free and in cultivating themselves to the maximum.
Mm-hmm. So on Islam, I had this conversation with someone from the Federalist that I don't understand how Islam is not in contradiction to the United States Constitution. I understand it's a controversial thing to say, but the First Amendment, freedom of religion and separation of church and state that comes with it, is not at all consistent with a religion that demands submission. Islam means to submit. Muslim is the one who is submitted. So it's a very valid question to ask if a practicing Muslim ends up in the Congress, whether or not you're loyal to Islam or you're loyal to the United States of America.
Practicing Muslims have no place in the United States of America, period, let alone in the United States Congress. I analyzed this in an essay called A Critique of Shiite Esotericism, a critique of Shiite esotericism. In my book, my anthology, Lovers of Sophia, one of the essays in there looks at the kind of Shiite esotericism that's supposedly the basis for the Islamic Republic, that Ayatollah Khomeini specialized in his seminary years and so forth. And it shows how this is not really authentic Islam. And, this kind of Shiite esotericism is not even authentic Shiaism of the Arab kind that, originated in Iraq during the time of, after the martyrdom of Hussein and so forth. Shiite esotericism is a kind of crypto-Zoroastrianism or crypto-Mithraism. And if you actually look at the Quran in detail, you see that it includes an entire political constitution. It is not just a religious text. The Quran is actually a political constitution which was used to govern Medina in Muhammad's lifetime. And there's nothing about, the power struggle between, Ali, Hassan and Hussein on the one hand, and the Sunni caliphs on the other hand, that would suggest in any way that the Sharia, which is the Sharia, which is mandated in the Quran itself, would in any way be abrogated by fatwas of ayatollahs or subsequent interpretations by mystics or anything of the kind. The transformation of Islam in that direction within the Persianate world was an attempt by Persians to preserve their own pre-Islamic mysticism. And, it was so effective within Iran and in sort of catalyzing this so-called Islamic Golden Age, that a lot of Western intellectuals have been mesmerized by this and confused into thinking that this is actually Islam. If you look at, what is in the Quran, it's clear, and I really refer to them to that essay where I quote chapter and verse to just make this crystal clear. In the Quran, you are not allowed to disbelieve in Islam once you are born into the Islamic community. And believing in Islam is not just a testimony of faith, it is adherence to a political code, a doctrine of jurisprudence that includes things like, extra draconian punishments for theft, the institutionalization of women's inferiority in society, all kinds of property laws. And,
yeah, ISIS.
Yeah. What was that?
ISIS.
Almost everything that ISIS practiced in Iraq or that the Taliban practiced in Afghanistan is based right in the Quran itself and the Sharia law code that was promulgated by Muhammad in his lifetime and used to govern Medina. Now, this is a fact. And so, again, to go back to what I was saying earlier, it's incoherent to understand freedom of religion as a right that would include toleration and acceptance of people who are fundamentally intolerant and want to strip everybody else of their freedom of religion. This makes no sense whatsoever. Now, I would say this is also true of certain like Judeo-Christian sects that are, firmly grounded in the Old Testament and that, believe in using, I don't know, the book of Leviticus or Exodus or something to develop a quote-unquote biblical republic. Those people shouldn't be tolerated either. But demographically speaking, they're a lot less of a threat than Muslims are. And the Bible as a text is fundamentally different from the Quran insofar as it was composed by tens of different authors over the course of hundreds of years, and it includes many internal contradictions as a result of that. The Quran is much more like, Mao's little red book. It is a doctrinal document produced by one man with one vision at a particular time, and yet he very clearly mandated that vision be immutable and eternally applicable, at least until, the apocalypse. So yeah, you're absolutely right that Islam in its authentic form doesn't belong in American society, let alone that Muslims should be serving in the United States Congress and taking their oath of office on the Quran. It's absolutely preposterous, and it's a fundamental threat to the Republic.
It really is. Ayaan Hirsi Ali said, the tolerance of intolerance is cowardice. That's exactly what it is. But Peter Boghossian was talking about there is a move in jiu-jitsu that it's like this, that you hold on to your one arm, that the other one can be. And he said that this one is the far left, is a progressive left that is hold on to the Islamists and the fundamentalists. For as long as this stays here, nothing can be done here. So it seems like, again, we're going back to this progressive left, the end of which is centralized system of tyranny and neo-feudalism with Chinese Communist Party at the top. It seems like it.
That's exactly right. And, this kind of deracinated identity politics is being used to promote that agenda, which is one of the reasons why, from the beginning of my involvement in the alt-right, I was trying to take it away from identity politics in this kind of really narrow-minded, ghettoized sense, and toward a grand vision of, Indo-European shared destiny and a kind of, ethos that would be able to orient all of humanity in a way that allows us to successfully navigate the technological singularity.
Are you familiar with Aubrey de Grey?
The gerontologist.
He's a very long beard and long hair. He is the founder of Sense Foundation. They're working on longevity and immortality.
Yeah, it's been years, but I remember looking at some of the genetic, the biotechnology aimed at life extension.
Yes.
Research that he was doing in the early 2000s. I think the last time that I looked at that stuff was somewhere in the mid 2000s, but yeah, vaguely.
So the last time he was on Joe Rogan, he said what keeps him awake at night is that we're 5 to 7 years away from a major breakthrough with respect to longevity, after which people are able to live significantly longer lives. And that will change everything. That will change their philosophy. That will change their priorities. That will change their expectations. And he was saying what concerns him the most is that politicians, that our policymakers are not ready, which is a given. They are not ready. But can that immortality be seen, or relative immortality, be seen as this new point of alliance for humanity that goes against the practical practices of it that you see that, people are living beyond 100 and then maybe 150, 200, and many other advancement will come in the meantime. Wouldn't that also address this problem with religions, that everything that is being determined and arbitrated on this life is based on some kind of an ideal that you will receive in the next life? Because most people don't want to die.
Well, you know, I think it's even more profound than that, because, okay, look, life extension is one thing. And now that you refresh my memory, I do remember, I mean, wasn't Aubrey de Grey involved in those studies where they increased the lifespan of mice by 2 or 3 times, something like that?
Maybe, I'm not sure.
Yeah. And so it's feasible, and it is right around the corner.
Yeah.
But I think that, you know, far more profound than any, you know, life extension through genetic engineering, the effect of see, here's the thing. In Prometheism, my recent book, Prometheism, I argue that the technological singularity is inextricable from what I call the spectral revolution. And this is the idea that as we get closer to the technological singularity in really well-funded research programs that are aiming at developing strong artificial intelligence, or even as we try to you know, develop an even more comprehensive, thoroughgoing mastery in editing the human genome, we are going to come up against anomalies in these research programs. Anomalies where, you know, as they're attempting to develop strong AI inside quantum computers, they see instances of psychokinesis, anomalies in genetic engineering research programs where there are mutations that cannot be accounted for by, you know, the reductive materialist scientific paradigms that these researchers are doing their work on the basis of. And they're going to need to, at that point, take into consideration, you know, the many decades of research that's been done by parapsychologists, and the AI research programs and genetic engineering research programs leading us toward the technological singularity are in effect going to legitimate the whole history of parapsychological research and bring about what I call the spectral revolution, which is a scientific revolution in some ways comparable to the Copernican revolution and the Darwinian revolution, but much more profound, because at that point, when we acknowledge, you know, telepathy and other forms of extrasensory perception and psychokinesis and so forth as legitimate, not just human abilities, but capacities that we see in various organisms in nature, at that point, we will become conscious for the first time of the way in which scientific paradigms condition and constrain our thinking. And then we'll be able to engage in various research programs that are post-paradigmatic. They can take place unrestricted by any one particular scientific paradigm and use various theoretical models in order to accomplish different ends in terms of you know, discovery and innovation. And so where I was going with this is that I think that the impact of that kind of spectral revolution on religion is far more profound than anything you're going to see as a result of genetic engineering leading to life extension. It's not just that, you know, people living 300 years or, I don't know, 1,000-year lifespans are going to understand spirituality differently. They're going to be disabused of various religious dogmas. Once, you know, AI researchers discover that there's a kind of consciousness that's not reducible to the biological organism and that it can survive physical death, and we can track it as it does, and we can, you know, potentially guide a soul, for lack of a better word, from one body into another, potentially into an android body. Once those kinds of capabilities are developed within, you know, well-funded mainstream research programs, it's going to have an absolutely devastating effect on revealed religion and all kinds of religious dogma. And this is actually one of the reasons why I worry about the rise of China, because unlike Westerners who subscribe to, you know, an Abrahamic religious revelation, right? I mean, Judeo-Christianity, like Islam, is a form of Abrahamic religious revelation. Unlike Westerners who, you know, have this revealed Bible as the basis of the religious belief system, the Chinese, you know, Confucian worldview is not going to be as destabilized. There's not going to be as, you know, severe a socio-political upheaval. It will not be as traumatic for them to process these breakthroughs in scientific research, the legitimate ESP and mind over matter, as it were, and that potentially present scientific evidence for reincarnation, it will not be as difficult for them to handle those breakthroughs as it will be for Westerners, particularly, let's say, evangelicals or traditionalist Catholics, who are going to be traumatized by these discoveries and immediately will brand the scientific researchers engaged in this kind of endeavor as agents of the Antichrist,
Yep.
who are promulgating black magic and sorcery. And so we face potentially another crisis like the one that we did during the epoch of the witch burnings, when Giordano Bruno was burned at the stake during the Renaissance and so forth. And that's another of the major concerns that my project of Prometheism is trying to address.
That is a very valid concern, because we've already seen the example of that with Google Glass, how people got attacked in San Francisco and around Silicon Valley. The buses of these companies were attacked just because of Google Glass. That somebody, actually the president of the Transhumanist Party of United States I was talking to, he brought an interesting angle that the problem with Google Glass was the elitist way that it was released, that not everybody could have access to it. You had to be chosen, you had to be selected in order to have. But I think it goes beyond that, exactly what you said, that you use China as an example. I always use Japan. That you go to a Shinto temple, you come out, you see the most high-tech high-rise, and then you go to a Buddhist temple that has a robot priest that Japanese people who go to a shrine, they go and talk to that robot and they interact. They're not kicking it. They're not offended by it. They don't think that it's going to take their jobs away. So that is the biggest uphill, it seems like, for the West. It's social adoption of whatever kind of technology and advancement that is going to come, because they work as well as the society that adopts those kind of advances.
And this is one of the reasons why we need Japan and we need India as our close allies and partners in this global Prometheus project. Because like China, who is our primary adversary, the Japanese and the Indians have a kind of spiritual orientation, non-Muslim Indians, of course, have a kind of spiritual orientation that will afford them the capability of navigating these kinds of dramatic breakthroughs more effectively. And so, while I'm advocating an ethos based on the archetype of Prometheus, I certainly would encourage the spread of Zen Buddhism or Vajrayana Buddhism in the West, and a deeper connection with the Indian branch of the Indo-European world. Not to call it a civilization, because it's beyond the concept of civilization, but I would encourage certainly Westerners to have a deeper appreciation of the various spiritual traditions of India, the various forms of the Dharma there, as well as the Buddha Dharma, that Japan, I think, really is the greatest protector and defender of in our world today.
So was the Iran Renaissance project a project to bring the future Iran within this exact alliance that you're describing?
That was exactly how I saw it. And so I was working with them and with the alt-right at the same time so that I could integrate these into a kind of global project. And at one point, I thought that Iran would maybe be a great place to have a kind of United Nations of the Indo-European world. That, America, and Russia and maybe even India, Europe as well, they all want to be the center of everything, right? They're used to being major world powers, in the case of the United States and Russia, superpowers. And so there would be great contention between America, Russia, maybe even Europe and India over, being the center, being the heart or the brain of this global Indo-European order, right? And so I thought Iran could play a fascinating mediating role and be a kind of crossroads and nexus for the entire Indo-European world, including its Buddhist wing. After all, I think a strong case can be made that actually the origins of Buddhism go back to Iran. That's a whole subject in and of itself. Yeah, well, I've argued that Buddha was actually an Iranian Scythian, and that it's not just that Buddhism was fundamentally shaped by the Iranian colonization of North India under the Kushans, so that Mahayana Buddhism is an almost entirely Iranian creation. It's actually the case that, I mean, there's a lot of evidence that Gautama, Sakyamuni, was a Saka, that he was a Scythian himself. This is in my book, Iranian Leviathan. I spend a couple of chapters on that. So, Iran is also very closely linked. I mean, there's a reason the Bamiyan Buddhas, the most colossal Buddhas in the world, were in Eastern Iran, Afghanistan being a bullshit country. There's a reason why the most colossal Buddhas in the world were carved in Eastern Iran. Eastern Iran was the Mecca of Buddhism for centuries and centuries. So I thought Iran would be a great place for a kind of, union of Indo-European nations to coalesce. But unfortunately, I found in the course of my work with the Persian Renaissance Foundation that my colleagues, the leader of that organization, and other high-level members that I was, closely involved with, did not have that scope of vision. And they also were too, in my view, deferential toward, people in the State Department and various American politicians who I just found, as we say in Persian, chende shalvar, people, hair-raising people who are like, give me the creeps, John Bolton types and so forth, who are associated with, say, Mujahideen Khalq, the MEK, the Islamist Marxist opposition group to the Islamic Republic, and various other, bad actors whose involvement in any change in Iran would, I think, compromise the country's territorial integrity and allow it to be carved up and looted by various foreign powers, Israel and others. So, I had a falling out with them over that, unfortunately.
Yeah, I mean, Iranians, the way that you describe all these major countries are going to be at each other's throats in order to who's going to lead this future world. That's how it's been within Iranians forever. We don't have one reliable opposition to this. I believe it's an occupying regime that is in Iran. It has nothing to do with Iran and Iranians and the Iranian culture. It has occupied the country. But, in absence of any kind of a valid opposition, forget about the vision, because what you portrayed is obviously awesome and is ideal. The other side of this is Iran just being torn apart as a result of some kind of a civil war that, it's completely possible in absence of this uber centralized kind of a theocracy that has been formed in Iran, especially after Khomeini, with Khamenei, that he, everything is about him. He's gone. It's this vacuum of power. Who's going to fill it? Which part is going to fall out, and how the other countries, surrounding countries and major powers are going to take advantage of it.
Yeah, I mean, even though I remain in favor of an Iranian Renaissance, as an idea, I resigned from the Persian Renaissance Foundation, where I was the senior advisor to the executive committee. I resigned because I came to the conclusion, and let me say, after being involved like in actual practical high-level lobbying efforts, let me leave it at that, okay? I became, and various discussions with stakeholders in any potential change in Iran, I became convinced that there was no viable opposition, and that if an attempt were made under the present conditions to overthrow the Islamic Republic, it would lead to the territorial disintegration of Iran. Yeah. We would see a larger Azerbaijan to our north. We would see, the Iranian part of Azerbaijan that remains within Iran amalgamated to the Republic of Azerbaijan. We would see an independent Kurdistan. We would see the majority of Iran's oil resources severed from a rump state of Persia, which would be economically destitute because it loses the oil of Khuzestan that the Saudis intend to turn into the Arab Republic of Al-Ahvaz. And then, of course, Baluchistan will become a fortress for Sunni terrorists coming in from Pakistan. So it would be an utter catastrophe. And until someone can convince me, that there's a viable nationalist opposition that can cohesively govern the country, in the wake of the collapse or overthrow of the Islamic Republic, I remain skeptical of whether it's such a good idea to do that at this time.
Yeah, likewise. And, I'm not buying into nice words. It doesn't matter who says them. Yeah. I think we're way past that. This idea that, like in Africa, I think this is in Nigeria, that they didn't have landlines and all of a sudden they have cell phones. it's like this, there is a certain kind of insight and wisdom in that, hey, we don't have to catch up with landlines. We didn't have them. That's fine. Let's catch up with whatever is coming next. When I hear people, you know, the opposition of Iranians, they're saying we need democracy in Iran. I'm like, oh my God, like, what are you talking about? Democracy in the decade that in 5 or 6 years, it will be so easy for anybody to 3D print a weapon and say, this is what I'm saying. I don't agree with the majority. I'm just going to create my own zone that now they're creating all across the United States as well.
Yeah, I agree with you entirely. And also, you know, if you're a pro-democracy advocate in an Iranian context, you're a retard because you don't understand your own culture.
Yeah.
I mean, I get incensed. Okay, if you understand square one about Persian political philosophy and the cultural identity of Iran, Iran is the bastion of a political thinking that's an alternative to democracy. Let's put it that way. I mean, you know, Iran's great value to the wider Indo-European world is to help develop a coherent, sophisticated alternative to democracy. That's the kind of resource that our Persian tradition has to offer the wider Indo-European world. Turning Iran into a democracy is you know, losing sight of the fundamental character and the greatest strengths of, you know, Persian political thought going all the way back to Darius.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. About United States, where we are right now is a weird place. Some people say that, you know, we're at the edge of a precipice, which is true, absolutely. But at the same time, you know, everybody talks about the revolution. Not that many people are talking about the day after the revolution. So with you having Prometheism and Prometheus movement as the point of alignment for your perspective, first of all, where do you see United States is right now, today, and what steps need to be taken for the U.S. from today until the ideal place in Prometheism, or according to Prometheism perspective, that you feel comfortable that this is the direction that we're headed towards?
Look, I'll be very honest with you. I mean, this is a question that's setting me up for what's going to be a very controversial answer, but I'm not going to pull any punches. I'll be very, very straightforward with you. There are two potential tracks. One, and the one that I prefer, frankly, is that Trump uses every mechanism, every opportunity open to him to make it clear that this election has not only been frauded, but that there has been treasonous foreign intervention involved in an attempted theft of this election, okay? And that the big tech people and the deep state officials, 50 of which had the courtesy to introduce themselves to us when they signed that letter saying that the Hunter laptop was a Russian disinfo operation. I mean, this is unbelievable.
Yep.
The audacity of these 50 former intelligence officials, including 5 former directors of the CIA, to sign their names to a piece of paper that alleges that, you know, there was this Russian disinfo operation promoting the Biden laptop story, when there's not a shred of evidence for that, and it's now since been admitted that, you know, Biden is under investigation. This is actually spectacular, because what these people did was they basically gave us a roster of the members of the deep state in the intelligence community. We know who they are now. Mm-hmm. We know who they are. And we know that the same big tech people who are screwing around on Twitter and on Facebook to, you know, suppress the New York Post story, to block Donald Trump's tweets despite his being president of the United States, we know these big tech people are in bed with China, and we know that the Biden family is in bed with China. And so I want to see President Trump within the next, what is it now? I don't know, 20-something days until
January 6th?
30 days or so until, you know,
inauguration.
The inauguration. I want to see him use every avenue open to him, beginning with Director of National Intelligence Radcliffe's assessment of the election. Use every avenue open to make sure that he's the one taking the oath of office on January 20th and continue into his second term. In that event, there will be a massive, violent uprising in all of the blue state cities, and the president of the United States will be forced to engage in a civil war. He will become the second president in the history of the United States after Abraham Lincoln to have to go to war against his own people, okay? And I don't think it's coincidental at all that he chose a former national counterterrorism director as his Secretary of Defense.
Green Beret.
Yeah. You only do that when you're planning to go to war inside your own country. That guy doesn't have a qualifications to be, Secretary of Defense if you're planning various foreign, endeavors and so on and so forth. He's focused domestically, and it's in anticipation of waging a second civil war. So I would prefer to see that scenario unfold. As bloody and as, catastrophic as it may be for a couple of years, until all these people in the deep state are prosecuted and purged from the system, that would be much healthier for America. And then we're going to get the kind of Trump administration that we wanted from the beginning, one with General Flynn in it, one with Steve Bannon in it. And this Prometheus vision that I have can then be, like, right off the bat, in a very, gentle fashion. It can be, phase by phase introduced into the public political discourse, and policies can be, tailored that are in a way that's inspired by this worldview. Okay, and it won't become immediately explicit, but over time we can, we can at least inspire policymaking in the second Trump administration in the same way as the neocons did during the George W. Bush administration, right? I mean, in the same way that Leo Strauss's political philosophy inspired some of the policies, detrimental policies of the W. Bush administration, we can, in a positive sense, philosophically inspire policies beginning with the second Trump administration. I think that's the more favorable course, as catastrophic as it will be in the near term. The second possibility is that, Joe Biden will be sworn in on January 20th, and we're headed for a few years of Biden and then potentially a 10-year-long Kamala Harris presidency, because I don't see how, if the deep state was able to rig this election with Donald Trump in control of the executive branch of government, how after 4 years of their total control of the government, Trump or anyone else opposed to the deep state will be able to prevail in the 2024 election. I just don't see it. Yep. So I think we're headed for a very long-term struggle. And then I think, we would have to kind of retreat within ourselves for a certain period of time, develop a very, sophisticated, coherent, complex, not only political ideology, but a program, and also develop an alternative platform for communication and organization, because they're going to close all the doors of social media to us within those 4 years. The crackdown on Twitter and Facebook and so forth, and YouTube, where you can't even discuss the election fraud anymore, are going to become much worse, and it will be imperative for the right to develop an independent tech platform and network. And we're then engaged in a long-term struggle that will not afford us another opportunity for direct intervention until probably about 2032. And unfortunately, if that happens, if that's the track we wind up on, when the change takes place, it will be far more violent and vicious than it would be in 2021 rather.
Mm-hmm. I absolutely agree with you. I mean, this is not a normal kind of a situation. This is not a political conflict. This is really a philosophical and the conflict of meaning. What is the purpose of us living in this country? And, what's the purpose of this country? Just be the country. Where are we headed? So most people don't know, and even less people know about what we talked about with respect to technology. I'm very happy that you're on the right, and I'm very happy that you said it was a point to make this connection with Steve Bannon inside White House, because I'm not hearing it from anybody else on the right, but what I'm hearing is unbelievable backlash towards transhumanism, that I'm saying, hey, I agree with you if the transhumanism is controlled by a centralized entity like the Chinese Communist Party. Mm-hmm. But transhumanism, it really is a civil right issue of our time, that if somebody wants to merge and go beyond our biological boundaries, it's no one's business to tell that person, hey, you're not allowed to experiment with your own body, or you're not allowed to experiment with joining this kind of a network or developing this kind of a system that could threaten us. But you know, we're headed towards, as you said, very, who knows, but conflict is something that is definitely going to be guaranteed, because we you know, we are redefining meanings and the fundamentals of our civilization that we have taken for granted for many, many, many centuries.
Yeah, you know, and in terms of transhumanism, it's not as if the federal government of the United States needs to adopt some kind of a uniform policy with respect to, you know, the potentials of biotechnology or, you know, cybernetic enhancement. The United States is the nation that could potentially emerge as the leader in terms of you know, transhuman evolution of humanity, precisely because of the scope of liberty that's left to the individual within states that are allowed to determine their own policies.
Yeah.
You know, the United States Constitution, with the liberty that it grants to various states to develop their own policies with respect to, you know, public health and technology, is, you know, potentially the country that could advance most rapidly in terms of these technological developments. I mean, I draw another analogy that is going to get me into trouble, but fact of the matter is that in the 1920s, the United States was the world's leader in eugenics. The Germans copied the Americans in terms of eugenics. And I'm certainly not in favor of compulsory sterilization or any kind of old school eugenics. The whole point of contemporary emerging biotechnologies is that, you know, they are enhancements that you know, one can opt in or out of on an individual basis, right? I mean, there's no reason why these kinds of genetic modifications should be compulsory, or there should be some top-down federal approach to them. But if we simply leave it in the hands of the states, the way that the federal government left eugenics in the hands of the states in the 1920s and 30s, you'll get all kinds of different policies in different places, and people who want to benefit from these kinds of technologies will move to, I don't know, Nevada, you know, Colorado, wherever, you know, that have more liberal policies in that respect. And so that's all that needs to be done. We just need to make sure that on a federal level, there's no ban on these technologies in the way that there is going to be in Germany or other parts of Europe.
Yeah, away from concentration of power, because power corrupts, absolute power corrupts.
Exactly.
Absolutely.
Exactly. Yeah, we don't want the Chinese approach where there's going to be state-mandated genetic engineering, potentially, you know, with deleterious consequences on a population-wide basis, but we also don't want a state-mandated ban on various uses of these technologies. If it's done constitutionally with proper respect for states' rights and for the rights of the individual, then, you know, the United States could even leap ahead of China in terms of, you know, seizing the potential of these technologies.
I totally agree. I mean, the possibilities are so in contrast to each other. It's insane that we're at this point in history. The book is called Prometheism by Jason Reza Jorjani. This was such a pleasure having you on the podcast. What's next for you, and where can people, our audience, follow? I will add all the links to your website and the books and everything when the episode is released, but where can our audience follow your work?
Well, my website is jasonrezajorjani.com, jasonrezajorjani.com, and it has links to all of my books, to my videos. You know, I've done tens and tens of interviews that are linked there, as well as to my social media. That's all linked at my website. And, you know, my latest book after Prometheism is this novel, which just came out. It's a sci-fi horror novel and my first work of fiction. And I think your audience in particular would probably find this at least as interesting as Prometheism.
Amazing. Thank you so much for introducing us to your new book, and congratulations. Let me ask you.
Thank you, Aga.
Yeah, absolutely. Let me ask you the last question I ask all my guests, that if you come across an intelligent alien from a different civilization, what would you say is the worst thing humanity has done, and what would you say is our greatest achievement?
Oh, man, that is profound. The worst thing that humanity has done The worst thing that humanity has done. My God, we've done so many awful things, but all of the awful things that we've done have been an expression of our willingness to sacrifice freedom for security. And I would say the worst thing that humanity has done is to misunderstand its fundamental nature. I think that what defines the human being, as opposed to various organisms in nature that have a kind of species being, what Aristotle called a species being, certain characteristics that are hardwired into them by their biology. What distinguishes humanity is the abyss of existential freedom and the demand on us to define our own character, to shape our own character, and to define our own destiny from out of the way that we've shaped our character. And I think it's precisely because we are so free on an existential level that we are constantly enslaving ourselves in various ways. Since we are a species that is not hardwired in any particular way, we compensate with all these rigid ideologies, okay? And it's not at all clear that that would be the case with various intelligent extraterrestrials. There may be intelligent extraterrestrials that are more like a beehive or a termite colony than they are like us. They may actually be hardwired in certain ways, despite their capacity to develop advanced technology. And so what I would say, to them is that, look, I mean, if let's say I come across a representative of a hive-minded species, right, a kind of Borg, I would say to them, look, our greatest sin is that we sacrificed the freedom that we had and that you don't. We gave up on, the gift, the natural gift that we were given of the freedom to define ourselves and to be the masters of our own destiny. We squandered what it is that you people never even had in the first place to make ourselves more like you. That's probably what I would say. And in terms of our greatest achievement, humanity's greatest achievement, I mean, it would be the same answer taken positively rather than negatively. It would be, all of those moments in history when, beginning with Cyrus the Great and Zarathustra and ending with, Philip K. Dick and Jackson Pollock, all of those moments in history where we explored our existential freedom to the maximum and we, produced just stunning works of innovative, creative genius, and basically redefine the limits of the possible. And I think that, in fact, in any potential encounter with extraterrestrial intelligence, that will be our greatest strength. Our scientists, our engineers will have nothing to teach those people. It's our artists, our philosophers, our writers, our musicians that will have something to offer in any encounter between humanity and an extraterrestrial intelligence. And so maximizing the conditions for creative freedom, I think, is a priority in terms of any imminent encounter with an extraterrestrial intelligence, because it's in that event that we will have the most to offer to them.